Imagine you're an elephant. Your herd has been walking for 2 days, not toward water, not toward food, toward something else. A pull with no name toward a place you've been before, and when you arrive, there's nothing there. Just dry grass, scattered bones, and the smell of a place that used to mean something. You reach down with your trunk and touch the skull. You've touched it before. You know its shape, and something happens in you that has no obvious survival purpose. You linger. You turn the bone. Other members of the herd do the same. Nobody eats. Nobody rests. Nobody moves on for a long time. There's no phone buzzing in your pocket telling you to be somewhere else. There's just this attention paid to something that used to be here and no longer is. This is the story of whether animals know what death is. And the answer, depending on what you mean by know, is far stranger than you think. Here's the thing most people assume. Animals don't understand death. They react to it, sure. A prey animal flees a predator. An immune system fights an infection. But actually grasping that a living thing has permanently ceased and will never return is supposed to be a uniquely human thing. Something that required language, self-awareness, philosophy, probably a few thousand years of lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. And here's what makes that assumption easy to hold. The evidence against it is mostly invisible. You can't ask a crow what it felt when its flock member died. You can't sit a chimpanzee down and say, "Tell me about your relationship with mortality." You can only watch. And for a long time, watching wasn't considered sufficient evidence of anything. Behavior that looked like grief was explained as instinct. Behavior that looked like mourning was explained as confusion, or disrupted routine, or something that would pass. The scientific community spent most of the last century training itself to be skeptical of animal emotions, and for good reason, because the alternative was anthropomorphism all the way down. But here's the question this video is actually asking, and it's not, do animals feel sad when someone dies? It's, is there evidence that animals recognize death as a permanent, specific, meaningful event? And if so, how deep does that recognition actually go? Because those are two completely different questions, and the evidence for the second has gotten very difficult to dismiss. To understand why this question is hard to answer, you have to understand what knowing about death requires at the level of brain hardware. At minimum, recognizing that a death has occurred, that a specific individual has permanently ceased, requires what cognitive scientists call object permanence with a twist. Object permanence, the basic understanding that a thing continues to exist when it's out of sight, develops in human infants around 8 months. Most mammals and birds have it. But death recognition requires something harder, not just knowing that an object persists when absent, but knowing that this particular absence is different from all other absences. It's not hiding. It's not sleeping. It's not coming back. It's gone permanently. And that requires the brain to hold two things simultaneously, a memory of what was and a model of what gone forever even. Means the region of the brain most associated with this kind of forward modeling in humans, holding what was against what is now and projecting across time, is the prefrontal cortex, the large frontal lobe sitting just behind your forehead. Elephants have a large, highly developed prefrontal cortex relative to their body size. Chimpanzees have a large prefrontal cortex. Dolphins, orcas, corvids all show significantly developed prefrontal architecture for their size class. The hardware, in other words, is present across far more species than was previously acknowledged. Whether the software is running the same program is the question. There's a second piece of hardware worth knowing about, the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, a region involved in the emotional processing of social pain. In humans, the ACC activates during grief. It also activates in response to watching others grieve. Structural and functional studies have found similar organization in the ACC of elephants, dolphins, and certain corvids, which means whatever grief is, neurologically, the scaffolding for it exists in more species than anyone was comfortable admitting. But here's where it gets interesting. In the 1970s, a researcher named Cynthia Moss began what would become one of the longest-running wildlife studies in history, tracking elephant families in Kenya's Amboseli National Park over decades. What she documented over those years changed how scientists talked about animal cognition. not because she found one dramatic event, but because she found the same behavior over and over in elephants with no contact with each other. Across generations, when an elephant died, the herd didn't simply move on. They gathered. They used their trunks and feet to investigate the body, touching the face, the tusks, the legs. They stood in what looked structurally like a vigil, quietly clustered around the remains for hours, sometimes returning days later. This alone could be explained as curiosity, as confusion about why a group member wasn't responding to social cues, as scent investigation. Scientists held those explanations for a while. Then in 2006, Karen McComb and her colleagues at the University of Sussex published a study that was harder to explain away. They presented wild elephants with three objects: an ivory tusk from a dead elephant, a piece of wood, and a piece of ivory from a different species. The elephants showed dramatically greater interest. More touching, more time spent, more return visits to the elephant ivory specifically. And when the researchers used the skulls of elephants the herd had known personally, the response intensified further. Some individuals stood and touched the skull of a dead matriarch repeatedly in a way they never touched any other object in their environment. Let that sit for a second. These were elephants recognizing and returning to the physical remains of individuals they had known, treating those remains differently from every other object in the world, in a way that had no obvious survival benefit whatsoever. The scientific language for what this implies is dead conspecific recognition, recognizing a dead member of your own species as meaningfully distinct. The human language for it is harder to say without sounding unscientific. But it doesn't look like confusion. In 2010, a team of researchers published observations from Bossou, Guinea, that made international headlines, which is rare for a study about chimpanzee behavior. A mother chimpanzee had lost her infant. The infant died, likely from a respiratory illness, at approximately 2.5 years old. And for 68 days, the mother carried the mummified remains, grooming it, responding to it, preventing other chimps from interacting with the body. What made this scientifically significant wasn't the emotion it implied, it was the persistence. If this was simply maternal drive that hadn't yet registered the death, you'd expect it to diminish quickly as the sensory cues, movement, warmth, sound, remained continuously absent. Instead, it continued for more than 2 months, during which the body had fully desiccated. Whatever mechanism was driving the behavior, it wasn't being overridden by the physical evidence that the infant was no longer alive. Something else was doing the work of keeping that infant present. At Kibale Forest in Uganda, researchers documented what they described as a death watch. Adult chimpanzees gathering around a dying group member, sitting quietly in a way visually distinct from normal social clustering. No grooming, no play, no eating, just proximity. One researcher noted that the silence during these gatherings was unusual enough to stand out. Chimpanzee groups are normally not quiet. The silence mattered. And then the chimps left and avoided that area differently afterward, as though something needed time to settle before normal movement through that space could resume. Now apply that to corvids, and things get stranger in a different direction. Kaylee Swift, a researcher at the University of Washington, spent years studying what happens when crows encounter a dead crow. What she found challenged the idea that this was simply an alarm behavior. Crows that found a dead crow gathered in large numbers, called loudly, then systematically avoided the area for weeks. They also showed elevated responses to humans who had been near the dead crow, associating that person with the danger that the death implied. But here's the detail that matters. The intensity of the response scaled with how familiar the dead crow was. Crows responded more strongly to the death of birds from their own territory than to unfamiliar birds. Individual recognition was modulating how they processed the death. That's not a generic alarm response. That's something more specific. And here's where it gets genuinely strange, because so far, everything described involves animals with relatively large brains and complex social structures. What about the patterns that run even wider? Giraffes have been documented standing over dead calves for up to 24 hours, returning repeatedly, showing reduced vigilance against predators during that period in animals whose normal state is near constant alertness against Exactly those predators. Geese have been documented showing behavioral changes, measurable for weeks after losing a mate: reduced foraging, reduced territorial behavior, increased separation from the group, patterns that look almost clinical in their parallel to bereavement. Gorillas have been observed sitting in sustained silence near dead group members, showing none of the typical social interaction that defines gorilla group life. Bottlenose dolphins have been documented supporting dying group members at the water's surface, in behavior that continued well past any point of ambiguity about whether the individual was still alive, and continued even after, as though the transition needed to be witnessed before movement was possible. Something is happening across these species. Something that doesn't reduce cleanly to instinct or confusion. The question is what, exactly? Then there's the orca matriarch finding, which is quieter, but possibly the most significant of all. In a study using decades of data from orca populations in the Pacific Northwest, researchers found that when a mother orca died, the survival rate of her adult sons declined significantly in the years following her death. Not calves, adult males, fully grown, capable of feeding themselves. The effect was most pronounced for the sons of post-reproductive females, mothers who were no longer producing calves but were still living, still leading. The most credible explanation isn't grief as a cause of death, it's knowledge. Orca matriarchs carry decades of accumulated information. Where food concentrates in lean years, which other groups to approach and which to avoid, migration patterns that only become necessary once a generation. When she dies, that information dies with her. Her sons, who had depended on her social leadership more than daughters typically did, were effectively navigating without a map. The death wasn't just the loss of an individual, it was the deletion of an irreplaceable cognitive archive. And that deletion cost them their lives. But here's the question that should be sitting quietly in the back of your mind, because we've been describing a specific kind of death awareness, recognizing that a particular individual has died and responding to that death in meaningful ways. And that's genuinely significant. But it is not the same as the version of death awareness that defines the human experience of mortality. Knowing that someone died is not the same as knowing you will die. The gap between those two things is arguably the gap that produced every religion ever invented, every monument ever built, every existential crisis anyone has ever had at 3 a.m. Humans don't just grieve specific deaths. We know in the abstract, with full cognitive awareness, that we personally will someday cease to exist. And we know it constantly, not just when confronted with a loss, but as background knowledge that colors everything. Every decision about legacy, every fear of insignificance, every impulse to leave something behind. Psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischinsky, drawing on the earlier work of Ernest Becker, built an entire framework around this called terror management theory. The argument that most of human culture is, at its foundation, a coping mechanism for this one unbearable fact: the chimpanzee mother carrying her dead infant, the crow avoiding the spot where a flock member died, the elephant returning to the skull of a matriarch. All of this suggests that animals can recognize the death of others. But do they know they personally will die? Is there an elephant lying in the grass running calculations about the finite number of rainy seasons remaining? Is there a crow somewhere contemplating its own non-existence? We don't know. That's not a scientific cop-out. That's a genuine epistemic wall, and it's worth being honest about where it sits. Let's pause and give the skeptic their due, because the skeptic has genuinely good points. The core problem with almost all of this research is that it's observational, and observational data about animal emotion runs directly into the anthropomorphism trap. We are extraordinarily good at reading human emotional states into non-human behavior. When a chimp mother carries a dead infant, we see grief because that's what a human mother in that situation would mean. But the chimp can't tell us what she's experiencing. The behavior might reflect a persistence of maternal bonding signals that haven't been overridden by the absence of response, a malfunction in the system, not a feature of mourning. The crow avoidance behavior is the most methodologically controlled in the literature, but even there, crows associate specific physical configurations with danger and adjust accordingly is a more conservative reading that doesn't require any death awareness. And the elephant studies, while remarkable, draw on observations from a small number of populations over long time frames. Generalization is assumed rather than demonstrated. What's harder to explain away is the convergence. Chimps, elephants, corvids, cetaceans, certain ungulates, independently evolved species with dramatically different brain architectures, showing behaviorally similar responses to death with intensity that scales with social familiarity. Convergent evolution usually means convergent selective pressure. Something is being selected for here. The question is what exactly it is that's doing the selecting. Here's the uncomfortable part of the story. The argument that animals don't understand death has been, for a long time, a load-bearing pillar of the moral framework that allows industrial animal use at scale. If a cow has no concept of its own mortality, then leading it to slaughter doesn't involve anticipatory suffering. The fear response at the end is just a reflex, not the experience of something that knows what's approaching. If a laboratory animal has no understanding of death, then watching other members of its group be removed, one by one, has no cumulative psychological cost beyond routine disruption. These weren't fringe positions. They were operational assumptions written into welfare frameworks and regulatory guidance, and applied to industries processing billions of animals annually, and they were based on an evidentiary standard that was never as solid as it appeared, and that is now being quietly revised in the scientific literature, one study at a time, while the operational assumptions of most industries remain essentially unchanged. The orca matriarch finding is worth sitting with one more time in this light. A community of animals carrying irreplaceable knowledge accumulated over decades, dismantled when one individual dies, not by violence, not by disease moving through the group, just by the death of the one who knew things no one else did. In human context, we have a name for this. We call it the death of the last speaker. When the last living speaker of a language dies, that language is gone, and with it, a way of perceiving the world that existed nowhere else and will never exist again. The orca matriarch is the last speaker. Every time one dies, something leaves with her that cannot be reconstructed. Nobody counted it as a loss for a long time, because the assumption was that there was no one home to lose anything. So here's where this lands when you pull all the way back. The question, do animals know they're going to die, was never really a binary. It was always a gradient. At the bottom of the gradient, every organism with a nervous system has something that functions like a death avoidance drive. The basic, not that. It kills reflex that evolution installs in anything that can die. That's table stakes. At the top of the gradient, the full human stack. Mortality salience running as a continuous background process. An entire civilization of cultural and psychological machinery built to manage a fact that, once you fully understand it, is almost too heavy to carry without help. And between those poles, stretched across millions of species and billions of years of evolution, there is something, documented, measurable, real, that doesn't fit cleanly into either just instinct or just like us. The crow that avoids the spot where its flock member died. The elephant that touches the skull of the one who led her herd for 40 years. The chimpanzee who carries her infant for 2 months after the infant is gone. These are not full human mortality awareness. But they're not nothing. They are something in between. At different points on the same gradient that ends with you, watching this video, knowing exactly how this ends for you. The reason we found it so easy for so long to believe animals don't understand death is the same reason we find it so hard to face our own. If death awareness is uniquely ours, our private, extraordinary burden, then it's also our private, extraordinary distinction. It makes us special. It justifies the gap between us and everything else. But if the gap was never a wall, just a slope, if the crow and the elephant and the chimpanzee are already on that slope, lower down, then knowing you're going to die isn't a crown, it's just a weight. One that gets heavier the higher up the slope you go, and every tomb ever dug, every afterlife ever imagined, every monument left by someone who knew they wouldn't live forever, all of it was built to carry that weight, which means civilization itself might be, at its root, one long answer to the question you started with, not a uniquely human question. The oldest question. So let's come back to that elephant, walking across the savanna toward a place with no food, no water, no obvious gain, arriving at bones she has touched before, reaching down, being still. You know now what she might know. Not everything you know. She almost certainly can't lie awake running the arithmetic on her remaining years. She probably has no word for what she's doing or why she returns. But she knows, in whatever way knowing works in an animal with that brain and that history, that something is absent that used to be present, that the absence is permanent, and that it matters enough to come back to.
Enough to stand still for. Enough to be quiet for. That's not nothing.
In the long history of life on Earth, that might not even be rare. It might be one of the oldest things there is. Older than language, older than fire, older than anything we built to manage the feeling, the bones on the ground. The pause before moving on. They might not know they're going to die, but they know when something is gone. They return to it.
They are still with it.
Maybe that's the same thing, wearing different clothes. Maybe it always was.